He didn't come to therapy because things were out of control. He came because they weren't. Everything in his life was organized, planned, anticipated, managed down to the smallest detail. His calendar wasn't just full, it was optimized. Every hour had a purpose. Every task had a place. Nothing was left to chance. And honestly, from the outside, it looked impressive. The kind of life most people say they want. No chaos, no confusion, no last-minute stress. Everything is running exactly the way it should. And yet, he felt something he couldn't explain. Not panic, not even anxiety in the usual sense. It was deeper than that. A quiet, constant exhaustion, the kind that doesn't go away with sleep, the kind that sits in your chest, even when nothing is wrong. Not from doing too much, but from never being able to let go. He said, "If I don't stay on top of everything, I feel like something will go wrong. Not eventually, not someday in the future, immediately. Like the moment he relaxes, something will slip, something will break, something will fall apart." And the strange part, he couldn't point to a real reason. Nothing in his current life was actually collapsing, but the feeling was still there, strong, persistent, unshakable, like his mind didn't trust reality unless he controlled it. Part 1. A life that looks perfectly managed. Marc was 42, reliable, structured, highly efficient, the kind of person people depend on without even thinking twice. At work, he was respected, not just for what he did, but for how consistently he did it. Deadlines were never missed. Problems were solved before they even became visible. Wait, if something could go wrong, Marc had already thought about it and fixed it. At home, things were no different. Everything functioned smoothly. Schedules were clear. Meals were planned. Responsibilities were handled without confusion. There was no arguing over who does what. No last-minute scrambling. No surprises. Even small things had structure. Weekends weren't just free time. They were organized in a way that made them feel productive. Relaxation was planned too. And for a long time, this system worked. In fact, it worked so well that no one questioned it. And not his colleagues, not his family, not even Marc himself. Because when everything is running smoothly, it's easy to assume everything is fine. But internally, it felt very different. It didn't feel calm. It felt tight. Like his mind was always slightly alert, always watching, like always calculating what comes next. Because of the stability in his life didn't feel natural. It felt maintained. Like it could only exist as long as he kept managing it. And that created a quiet pressure. A pressure that never really turned off. Even in moments that were supposed to be relaxing, his mind didn't fully step back. It stayed engaged. Scanning, adjusting, preparing. Because deep down, there was a belief he never questioned. If he stops, even for a moment, everything might start slipping, and that's the part no one else could see. From the outside, his life looked stable, but inside, it felt like holding something together, all the time. Part 2. When control becomes invisible, I asked him a simple question. What would happen if he didn't manage everything? He didn't pause, didn't think twice. Boom, things would fall apart. The answer came fast, automatic, not emotional, not dramatic, just certain. So I asked him to slow it down. What do you mean by fall apart? He leaned back slightly, as he'd already played this scenario in his head 100 times. Not something huge, he said. Just small things. Delays, missteps, people forget things. Plans are not going exactly how they were supposed to. And for most people, that wouldn't sound like a big deal. But for him, that was enough. Because those small things didn't stay small in his mind. They created something else. Disorder. And disorder for him wasn't just uncomfortable, it felt wrong, like something that shouldn't exist in the first place. So he prevented it, constantly, not in obvious ways, not in ways that people would easily notice. That's what made it invisible. He didn't walk around saying, "I need control." Instead, he adjusted things quietly, checked details before anyone asked, reconfirmed plans that were already clear, fixed things before they became problems. If someone said they'd handle something, he still followed up, just in case. If a plan was set, he mentally ran through it again, looking for gaps. If a decision was made, he reviewed it to make sure nothing was missed. Not occasionally, continuously, like a background process that never shuts off. And over time, it became so natural, he stopped noticing it. It didn't feel like control. It felt like responsibility, like being on top of things, like being the reliable one, the dependable one, the one who makes sure everything works. And because of that, no one really questioned it. In fact, people appreciated it. They trusted him more, relied on him more, gave him more responsibility, which only reinforced the pattern. Because every time things went smoothly, it confirmed his belief. See, this works. If I stay involved, nothing goes wrong. But here's the part he couldn't see. It wasn't just preventing problems, it was also preventing something else, letting go. Because the moment he stepped back, even slightly, his mind didn't relax. It filled the gap immediately with questions. What if something is missed? What if someone forgets? What if this doesn't go as planned? And those what ifs weren't loud. They weren't panic-driven. They were quiet, persistent, logical sounding. This made them harder to challenge. So instead of questioning them, he responded to them by doing more, checking more, staying involved just a little longer. Right, and that's how control stayed in place. Not as a choice, but as a default, something automatic, something that felt necessary, even when nothing was wrong. And the tricky part? The more he did it, the more invisible it became. Because when a pattern is always there, you don't see it anymore. You just live inside it. And for Marc, control wasn't something he used sometimes. It was something he never turned off. Part 3. The illusion of control versus the need for safety. Control is often misunderstood. Most people think it's about perfection, about things being flawless, exact, precise. But that's not what was happening here. Marc didn't need everything to be perfect. He needed everything to be known. There's a difference. Perfection is about outcomes. Knowing is about predictability. And predictability creates something powerful. A sense of safety. Because when you know what's going to happen, your body can relax. Even if the outcome isn't ideal. Even if things aren't perfect. At least they're expected. At least they make sense. But when something is uncertain, even if it's small, even if it's harmless, the mind reacts differently. It doesn't see possibility, it sees risk. And for Marc, that reaction was immediate, not dramatic, but fast, almost automatic. If something wasn't clearly defined, his mind filled in the gaps. If a plan felt incomplete, he completed it. If a situation had variables, he reduced them. Because uncertainty didn't feel neutral. It felt unstable, like something that could shift at any moment. And that feeling, it was enough to activate him. So control wasn't about making things perfect. It was about removing that feeling. That slight edge of not knowing, that quiet tension that comes with unpredictability. He wasn't chasing perfection. He was avoiding discomfort. But the problem is, life doesn't work that way. It never has. No matter how much you plan, there are always unknowns. Always variables you can't account for. Always outcomes you can't fully control. And when someone tries to eliminate all of that, control becomes endless because there's always one more detail, one more possibility, one more just in case. And that's exactly what was happening. Marc wasn't controlling big things once in a while. He was controlling small things all the time because small uncertainties still counted, still mattered, still triggered that same internal response. So his system stayed active, always scanning, always adjusting, and always trying to close the gap between what is known and what isn't. But here's where it gets complicated. The more he controlled things, the more stable his environment became. And that looked like success. Everything worked. Everything flowed. Everything stayed on track, so it reinforced the belief, this is necessary. This is what keeps things safe. But in reality, it wasn't creating safety. It was creating dependency. Because now, stability depended on him, on his attention, his effort, his constant involvement, and that's a heavy position to be in. Because it means if he steps back, even a little, everything feels at risk, not because it actually is, but because his system has learned no control equals no safety. And that belief doesn't question itself. It doesn't pause and say, is this still true? It just runs, quietly and consistently, in the background. And over time, it starts to feel like reality, like a fact, instead of a pattern. So even when nothing is wrong, his body doesn't fully relax. Even when things are going well, his mind stays slightly alert because it's not responding to what's happening. It's responding to what could happen. And that difference changes everything. Because now, peace doesn't come from reality. It comes from control. And if control is always required, then peace is always temporary, always conditional, always dependent on effort, which means true rest never really happens because rest requires something very specific. Trust. Trust that things can still hold together without constant management. Trust that uncertainty doesn't automatically lead to failure. And for Marc, that trust hadn't fully developed yet. Not because he couldn't trust, but because at some point in his life, not knowing didn't feel safe. And once your system learns that, it doesn't forget easily. Part 4. A past where unpredictability had consequences. To understand control, you have to go back to where it started. Because patterns like this don't appear randomly, they've learned. Built slowly over time. Usually in environments where something felt off. Not necessarily chaotic, not extreme, just unpredictable enough. Marc grew up in a home where things could change quickly. Plans didn't always stay the same. What was decided one day might be different the next. Sometimes the rules were clear. Sometimes they weren't. Sometimes expectations were consistent. Other times they shifted without explanation. It wasn't dramatic. There were no big, obvious events you could point to and say, that's the reason. But there was a pattern, an inconsistency, a subtle instability. And for a child, that matters more than people realize. Because children don't just look for safety in big things. They look for it in predictability, in knowing what comes next, in understanding how things work. When that predictability is missing, even slightly, the system adapts. Not consciously, automatically. Marc didn't sit there as a child and decide, I need to control everything. That's not how it works. Instead, he started paying attention, more than usual. He noticed patterns, changes, shifts in tone, in behavior, in expectations. He learned to read the environment carefully, to pick up on signals others might ignore, because those signals mattered. They told him what was coming next, not chaos. And the more accurately he could predict that, the safer he felt. So he became prepared, organized, anticipatory. If something might change, he thought about it in advance. If a situation felt unclear, he tried to clarify it. If there was a chance something could go wrong, he mentally planned around it. Not because he wanted control, but because it reduced stress. It gave him a sense of stability in an environment that didn't always provide it. And over time, that strategy worked. It helped him navigate situations better, avoid problems, stay one step ahead. So his system learned something important. This is useful. This keeps you safe. And once the brain learns that, it holds on to it. It builds around it, strengthens it, repeats it, until it becomes automatic, until it becomes part of how you function. Yeah, and that's exactly what happened. By the time he reached adulthood, this pattern was fully integrated. Not as a strategy, he sometimes uses it, but as a default way of operating. Always aware, always prepared, always slightly ahead, which in many ways looked like a strength. And honestly, it was. It helped him succeed, stay organized, be reliable. But here's the part that's easy to miss. The environment changed, but the pattern didn't. As an adult, his life wasn't unstable in the same way. Things were more consistent, more predictable, more within his control, naturally. He wasn't in that same environment anymore, but his system didn't update automatically, because the brain doesn't work like that. It doesn't say, okay, things are different now, let's relax. It says, this worked before, keep doing it. So even when predictability existed, he still created more of it. Even when things were stable, he still prepared for instability. Even when there was no clear threat, his system stayed ready, just in case. And that, just in case, became constant. Because from his system's perspective, it made sense. If unpredictability once created stress, then removing unpredictability should prevent it. So why stop? Why take the risk? Why allow uncertainty back in when has control been working so well? And that's the hidden layer. Control didn't feel excessive, it felt justified, logical, even necessary, because it was built on real experiences, real adaptations, real moments where being prepared actually made a difference. But what worked then was now being applied everywhere, even where it wasn't needed, or even where things were already safe. And that's where the cost begins. Because when a protective pattern stays active too long, it stops feeling like protection and starts feeling like pressure, like something you have to maintain, something you can't step away from, because stepping away feels unfamiliar, uncertain, and uncertainty for his system still carried meaning, still felt like something to avoid. So instead of relaxing into the present, he stayed slightly ahead of it, managing what hadn't happened yet, preparing for things that might never come, and slowly, without realizing it, he wasn't just responding to life anymore, he was trying to stay in front of it all the time. Part 5. Why his system couldn't relax. By the time Marc reached adulthood, his environment had changed, but his system hadn't. And that's where things start to feel confusing. Because logically, everything was fine. His life was stable, his work was secure, his relationships were functioning. There was no constant unpredictability anymore. No shifting rules, no unclear expectations. So on the surface, there was no real reason to stay on high alert. But internally, nothing had switched off. Because the nervous system doesn't update based on logic. It updates based on experience. And more importantly, on repetition. Marc's system had spent years learning one rule. If you don't stay in control, something will go wrong. Not as a thought, as a feeling, as a reaction, something that happened instantly without needing to be explained. So even when his adult life became safer, more stable, his system didn't automatically trust it. It kept running the same program, in scanning for changes, looking for gaps, not because something was wrong, because something could be, and that possibility was enough to keep his body slightly activated, not in a way that felt overwhelming, but in a way that never fully settled, like a low-level tension that just stayed there, always in the background, always ready to rise if something felt uncertain. And uncertainty didn't have to be big. It could be small, a delayed message, a plan that wasn't fully confirmed, someone saying, "We'll figure it out later." For most people, that wouldn't mean much, but for his system, that was a signal, something incomplete, something unresolved, something that needed attention. So his mind stepped in, filled the gap, created a structure where there wasn't any, because structure brought relief, even if it was temporary, even if it required effort. It still reduced that internal tension, so the pattern continued, not because he chose it, but because it worked in the moment. It calmed the system, but here's the catch. It only worked short term, because every time he responded to uncertainty by increasing control, his system learned something again. Good. That worked. Do it next time too. So instead of learning that uncertainty is safe, his system learned that control is necessary, which means the threshold for discomfort got lower. Smaller uncertainties started triggering the same response, because the system wasn't practicing tolerance. It was avoiding it. And when you avoid something repeatedly, it doesn't disappear. It becomes more sensitive. So over time, his tolerance for not knowing shrank. Our even slightly unclear situations felt like something that needed fixing, something that couldn't just be left alone. And that's why relaxing felt so difficult. Not because he didn't want to relax, but because his system didn't recognize relaxation is safe. To relax means to stop managing, to step back, to allow things to unfold without interference. And for his system, that felt like a risk, even if his mind understood that nothing serious would happen. Because again, this wasn't about logic, it was about conditioning, about patterns repeated so many times, they became automatic. So when he tried to relax, something interesting happened. His body didn't fully follow. His mind stayed slightly active, still tracking things, still monitoring, still asking quiet questions in the background. And is everything okay? Did you forget anything? What if something comes up? And those questions didn't create panic. They created movement, a subtle push to stay engaged, to stay aware, to stay in control, just a little longer. And that's how the cycle continued. Control to relief to reinforcement, over and over again, until it no longer felt like a pattern. It felt like the only way things worked. But beneath all of that, there was something important, something his system hadn't fully experienced yet. The idea that things can remain stable, even without constant management. That not every unknown leads to a problem, that not every gap needs to be filled, and that safety can exist without control. But for that to happen, his system had to experience it directly. Don't think about it. Do not analyze it. Feel it. And that meant doing something unfamiliar, letting small uncertainties exist without immediately fixing them, which, at first, felt completely unnatural. Part 6. The moment he saw the cost of control, the shift didn't come from a big breakthrough. It came from a simple question. I asked him to notice one thing, not what control prevented. What does it cost? At first he didn't have an answer. Because when something feels necessary, you don't question its impact. You focus on what it protects. So we slowed it down, looked at small, everyday moments, times where nothing was actually wrong, but he still stepped in, still adjusted, still managed, and slowly something became clear. Control didn't just reduce uncertainty, it removed something else: spontaneity. Moments where things happen naturally, without planning, flexibility, the ability to shift, adapt, and let things unfold, and more than anything, shared responsibility. Because if he was always managing everything, there was no space for others to step in, even when they wanted to, even when they could. Everything came back to him, which meant one thing: he could never fully step back, never fully rest, never fully trust that things will be okay without his involvement. And for the first time, he saw it clearly. Control wasn't just protecting him, it was isolating him, quietly, gradually, in a way that was easy to miss. Part 7. Learning to tolerate small uncertainties. We didn't remove control completely. That wouldn't work. Instead, we reduced it, just a little, in small, manageable ways, letting someone else make a decision without correcting it, leaving a minor detail unplanned, and allowing something to stay unfinished. At first, it felt uncomfortable. His system reacted immediately. That familiar tension came back, the urge to step in, to fix, to organize. But this time, he didn't. He paused and waited, and something unexpected happened. Nothing collapsed. Things weren't perfect. There were small mistakes, minor delays, moments that didn't go exactly as planned. But the outcome? It was still okay, still stable, still manageable. And that experience started to change something, not all at once, but gradually. His system began to learn a new pattern. Uncertainty doesn't automatically lead to failure. Not every unknown needs to be controlled. Not every gap needs to be filled. And slowly, that constant pressure began to loosen. Months later, Marc described the change simply. I still like things organized, but I don't feel responsible for everything anymore. And that shift made space for something new. Breathing room. Moments where he could step back, without tension, immediately pulling him forward again. Because some people don't control things for power. They do it because, at some point, predictability felt like the only way to stay safe. It wasn't about perfection, it was about protection. But over time, that protection becomes a pattern, and that pattern becomes a weight. Something you carry, even when you don't need to anymore. Healing doesn't mean losing control completely. It means changing your relationship with it. Realizing that life doesn't fall apart the moment you loosen your grip. That stability can exist, even without constant management. And sometimes, letting go isn't a risk, it's a relief.